Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. We are going to take a look at some more 20th century boys, but you've probably already figured that out from the title of this video. Before we dive into this week's installment, which is the second half of Volume 1 of the Omnibus collection, or the Perfect Collection, I guess you could say, because that's the branding name. It is essentially an omnibus. But before we dive into that, a brief recap. In the first part, we're introduced to Endo Kenji, who is our protagonist, kind of a lame character. We are introduced to him first as a 10-year-old who dreams of being a hero and a world-famous guitarist and a number of other things, and ultimately saving the world from evil. And we then meet him in the modern era of 1997, when we really realize he's not any of those things. He's a convenience store manager. He's heckled by his mother. He's looking after his older sister's daughter, born out of wedlock. No apparent father, whose name is Kana. His sister has gone missing. His life is a wreck. It doesn't look like there's a lot of potential in Kenji. But as I'm sure you can tell by looking at this face, that appearance is deceiving. Now, much of the first half of this story is about Kenji realizing he's in danger. He's been living this simple, mundane life for the last 25 years or so. He's not really looking to be a cool guy who plays rock guitar in front of crowded stadiums or saves the world from evil anymore. He's just looking to provide for his family. And while that is a massive task and has made Kenji very strong, it has also prepared him to expect a very different kind of danger than what is coming for him. And the first 10 chapters here are about really Kenji breaking out of that mindset and beginning to realize that there are dangers other than just not being able to pay the bills or not having enough money to send Kana to college in case his sister never shows up again. So the first act of Kenji's story is kind of slow and it seems very mundane, but there are hints. We see Friend, who is the leader of a bizarre cult organization, and he is beginning to gain more influence in the wider world. He has a core group of very dedicated followers, but we are beginning to move beyond Waco and the Branch Davidians and into something a little bit scarier. Now, there was an interesting bit of storytelling that was dropped here, in that we were introduced to Kenji's friend, Donkey. And yes, he has a legal Japanese name. It's almost never used in any of the dialogue in this story. He's almost always called Donkey. And that is to emphasize the fact that the relationships of these characters were started when they were 10 years old. And in many ways, over the 27 years since then, they haven't changed. These characters have known each other for a very long time, but they haven't developed really deep relationships, the kind of relationships that are based on... they have the kind of relationships that are based on similar social circles, attending ceremonies and life events like marriages or funerals, but they don't have a really deep, meaningful relationship based on shared trial, shared loss, shared goals, or shared purposes. Their friendship is very shallow, much like when you compare them to the dreams they had in the beginning. They come off as very uncool. And that is significant because 20th Century Boys is a coming-of-age story, but it is about coming of age together. And it is about a coming of age across your entire life. You are, in a very real sense, always coming of age. Not only must you move from a child to an adult, adults go through phases of their lives that they must come into. And 20th Century Boys looks at our characters through several of these comings of age. Um, and this, the awakening to danger that Kenji has, is one. It's the most significant one because it is what begins the story, of course. Um, and it's also, interestingly enough, the one that seems to change Kenji the least. We get the impression that based on all the work he'd been doing to support and care for his family, he had, at least in general attitude and in toughness, come to be ready for this to a certain extent, which is very interesting. Um, and then his friend Donkey dies. The official story is that he committed suicide, but most people don't really believe that. Donkey was a very stubborn person, as his name might imply, and he was very optimistic. He believed that the world was getting better every day. Um, he believed that humanity was improving. That's why he chose to be a science teacher, and so on and so forth. He was very pragmatic and realistic. We learned in one of the flashbacks here that he didn't believe in ghosts. And Donkey is also a very interesting character in that we see him only in flashback. It doesn't seem that Kenji met Donkey again after really they graduated from the middle school they both went to. So we really see Donkey through the eyes Kenji sees him through. We see him in flashbacks and the occasional story from people who knew him more recently. And this is interesting because it plays into the theme of these relationships developing. And Kenji is inspired to dig a little deeper with his friends because one of them has suddenly vanished. That's not uncommon. That's not an uncommon story to tell. But there's more to it than that. As we move into this second stage of the story, as Kenji tries to figure out why Donkey might have committed suicide, he begins to probe into Donkey's life, and he finds an interesting connection. It seems that Donkey was looking into Professor Shikishima, who is the almost passingly mentioned missing person that started Kenji's entire investigation into his past and made Kenji aware of the danger. If you want to hear a little bit more about that, you can watch my video on the first part of this volume by following a link in the description. And really, most of this story is about Kenji trying to figure out who Friend is, what it has to do with the disappearance of Professor Shikishima, and why Donkey may have been killed for looking into this himself. And as Kenji starts to get closer and closer to the truth, well, as you might expect, since Donkey was killed over this, after all, Kenji gets to be in more and more danger. And as the danger gets worse, we are introduced to probably one of the most interesting characters in the story, and that is Kami-sama. For those of you who are familiar with Japanese, you know that Kami-sama is the name for a traditional Shinto spirit. They are creatures that a kami is a creature that inhabits the land and embodies it, and the Shinto priests will address it as Kami-sama. You might expect this to be a very powerful or influential person, but no. I'm afraid that, like all of our other protagonists, Kami-sama is a lot less than you might expect him to be. He's right there. He's a homeless guy. He lives on the street. And every so often, he has visions of the future, which almost always come true. And he sees that important things are happening around him. And he knows they have something to do with the manager of the convenience store where he gets food out of the trash. So when a dying member of the Friend cult winds up in Kami-sama's cardboard box, trying to get in touch with Kenji, well, we have a little bit of a coincidence here, but not that much of a coincidence. Kami-sama seems to pick the places he sleeps on the street very intentionally, so he doesn't get, picked up for homelessness or things like that. And sometimes because, well, just needs to be there. So he sends this one of his fellow homeless people to Kenji's store and arranges a meeting between the dying man and Kenji. And this is when it gets real. Kenji knows that he could be attacked and he could die. And he's kind of understood that intellectually since he began to suspect that Donkey was murdered as opposed to committing suicide. But this is when it becomes real. When he watches this man die, Kenji realizes that he is playing for keeps. This is not just an emotional look at the state of his life as he tries to sort out the impact of a close friend dying and losing that relationship that he never really explored, and realizing that there are so many things that he wanted to do and wanted to explore. There's more to it than that. There's a dark side to the things that Kenji has left undone. And that dark side is coming back to haunt him. When he was a child, Kenji led his friends. He was the leader, he was the heart and soul of the group. That's why he's the protagonist of this story, even if in adulthood, Kenji looks like the poorest, the lamest, the most burdened down by obligations he can barely meet. There is within Kenji the soul of a hero, for lack of a better way to put it. But while he has spent most of his life doing really mundane but heroic things like providing for his family and giving up on his dreams in order to ensure a better life for the people he cares about, and that's made him very strong, it has also encased him in a layer of apathy and cynicism that has to be stripped away. And through this first installment of 20th Century Boys, we see each layer of that apathy and that cynicism and that complacency stripped off of Kenji until at the end of the volume, he comes face to face with death and he realizes that this is the stakes he's playing for. It's not about trying to set things right between people. It's not about trying to recapture the spark to pursue his dreams. This is a battle between good and evil, and it has the potential to engulf the entire world. Kenji, right now, is all that stands between the world and destruction. And that's a pretty good opening for a story, if you ask me. We're going to learn a lot more about Kenji, about his dreams, about why he gave up on them as time goes on. But if this volume was all the character development Kenji had, he would still be a pretty good character. And I think that's a great tribute to Urasawa's ability as a writer. He is interested in showing us characters, men specifically, who come of age into every stage of their life. They go from being children to adults. They go from being young adults with very few responsibilities to taking responsibilities for families. And from there, they must take responsibility, furthermore, for the communities those families live in, so that their families can live safely and have a future. And from there, they find that there are even greater steps they must take to come of age. They must learn to teach. They must learn to mentor. But before all of that, they have to learn that in a very real sense, they must come of age and assume these responsibilities, because if they don't, someone is going to die. Not necessarily they themselves, could be someone they care about. But when you abandon your responsibilities, sooner or later, that is a life or death decision. And that is the point that is driven home by Kenji's opening act in 20th Century Boys. A really, really strong opening for the story. If you've read this, let me know what you think of it in the comments down below. That's all I've got for you today. So there's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use them as you see fit. And I'll talk to you later.